Everybody hear me? Are we all linked up? All right, so this is my first book event, but maybe I could just close up shop after today. This is so great. This might as well be the last also. I really appreciate you all coming out here on a cold day. It is a warm topic. I want to thank you, Mike, so much. We've been friends for a long time. You all will have friends coming out of here that you're going to have your whole lives. It's really it's a warm welcome to be introduced by you. And President Alger, I'm going to be speaking a lot today about the experiment that you all are part of here at James Madison under President Alger's leadership. I think this is a really vital, bold, important mission that has been laid out here at James Madison University, and I really admire and I think that a lot of people need to pay attention to your leadership and what's happening here with this university, and I just am very grateful for this invitation and to be part of this very important series. This is a huge honor for me, and especially with this topic of the book. I mean, you're a little bit, let's be frank, you're a little bit of a captive audience because you're at James Madison University and it's 8 degrees outside, so you got it. But it really is. It really is a great honor, and my sister Mira went here and graduated from here. She has everything that I'm hearing, the incredible percentage of you who volunteer and are involved in civic affairs. My sister was an AmeriCorps volunteer after graduating. She got a master in social work. She runs a nonprofit in Virginia now that's involved in advocacy and in the best traditions of what you all are being taught and trained to do here. So every book starts somewhere. Right? So this book, Becoming Madison, and this is my first time actually seeing the hardcover of this book today. So this is hot off the presses. It just got mailed here. For me, this book, Becoming Madison, began with a discovery that I made when I was leafing through one of the many large volume biographies of James Madison. And I was very interested in the ratifying convention that happened in Richmond in 1788, the year after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I knew that Madison had kind of run the Federalist strategy there, but what I didn't know was that he collapsed physically 2 times during the 3 weeks of the convention. What does that mean, he collapsed? It meant that he had some kind of fit that he described as epileptic or bilious, that caused him to have to flee the auditorium where the debate was happening and be holed up in his boarding house alone, depressed, anxious, feeling like the whole effort to ratify a constitution for the United States, therefore to save the country from what he thought was certain ruin, was on his shoulders because he was not in that room. Those absences kind of haunted me. What happened with him? And I thought there might be a book there. There might be something in there. And my theory going into this, my hypothesis, was that the collapses might undermine what I thought was a key misunderstanding about James Madison, one that I think has become the greatest impediment to him playing a larger role in our national discussion. And you can see that obstacle or that impediment in the title of a recent, well, not so recent now, but a biography, James Madison and the Heartless Empire of Reason. So we tend to think, you can also see it in a quote that's an epigraph of the book. I'm just going to read this. From nature, from habit, and may even be from the imperfect state of health to which Madison was reduced at the outset of his career, his was the most passionless course of education and elevation. He never addressed a passion or acquired a prejudice, but relying on reason alone for every conviction, he effected his purpose without any appeal to prejudices. So this is garbage. If you're interested in synonyms, I went to my thesaurus. It is folderol, hooey, poppycock, malarkey, tommyrot, trumpery, silliness, and twaddle. Okay, who among us, everyone here has been misunderstood, right? And by one person, a friend, a family member, a fellow student. I think this crucial misunderstanding of Madison does deep violence to our understanding of the origins of our country and his example and his ideas and the ability to have a leadership that might appeal to us and do important things to the country just when we need it most. My theory is exactly the opposite from that ridiculous quote. It's that Madison collapsed in that room in Richmond in 1788, not because he felt too little, but because he felt too much. Instead of an iceberg, right, or some kind of calculator, I think that he was more like lava underneath a rock that was boiling and ready to erupt at any moment, and that's what happened when he collapsed. Why does this matter? It matters because the country that Madison built was based on mastering the passions. The passions were always the threat to any democracy. I was trained in classical political theory. I hope that everybody here has the opportunity to read Plato and Aristotle, at least take a whack at these sources. So over 2 millennia ago, Plato tackled the problem of the passions in his famous dialogue called Phaedrus. And he imagined the urges that we all feel, the passions that take us over at any time, as massive steeds, really big horses. And he thought that one was good, those were the dignified. One was good and one was bad. The horse that was the follower of true glory, he said, was beautiful and dignified, a kind of an amazing animal. But he thought that there was another horse kind of in our souls, which was surly, and he described it as having a blood-red complexion and being inherently violent. And when the passions take control, Plato said, the dark steed would bolt away, would gallop away from the charioteer, and that was us. And he described how we can only control the dark steed. It's a very violent process if you have to break them, by yanking at the bit so violently that it would draw blood wrenching from his mouth, and then forcing the horse to the ground violently and taming him. And only then would the passions be tamed. But there was another alternative. And he wrote that when opinion by the help of reason leads us to the best, we could conquer the steed, the dark steed, through temperance. So in other words, we can avoid the violence of breaking the dark steed of our passions by training those passions never to bolt, and by moderation and through reason. So what I would suggest to you is when you see extremism destroying debate in our country today, you're seeing that classic problem that is a basic part of the human condition and of each of us. You're seeing the passions running amok. And when you see leaders pandering to those extreme ideas and letting themselves be dragged and tossed around by them, you're witnessing the passions. So Madison, on the contrary, built a country just as he built himself, meant to be governed and supported by people like him, who were well-versed in mastering the passions and who cared about temperance and about listening, and above all, in thinking about and achieving the common good, what was good for all of society, which is exactly the opposite from a passion. So just a word about the broader context there. I appreciated President Alger bringing this up. This is a sequel to the first book that I wrote, which was called Demagogue, The Fight to Save Democracy from Its Worst Enemies. So these books are both different angles on the same problem, which is how can democracy survive the structural weaknesses that the ancients first noted about it? In the ancient world, when democracy was first invented, so totally different from today. Imagine Virginia's 135 counties, 134 localities, each of them as a city-state, each of them having their own form of government. At that point, you had democracies, so you had many different city-states which were experimenting with a form of government. Almost invariably, the democracies, this is where you gave power to the people, would fail. And they would fail in a particularly violent, brutal way, which was what they called the cycle of regimes. The people would hand over their power to a demagogue, somebody who flattered them and who appealed to their prejudices and was attractive and charismatic. And they would give all their power to the demagogue, and the demagogue would pretty quickly become a tyrant, using the people's gift of their power against them. Then the tyrant would be overthrown by a group of noblemen who would then establish an oligopoly, and that would be equally brutal. And then the people would overthrow the oligopoly. This happened over and over again. It was called the cycle of regimes. The question is how to stop that cycle of regimes. And in the first book, I draw on thought from Thomas Jefferson to Alexis de Tocqueville to Hannah Arendt. If you read the Federalist Papers, they talk about demagogues at the beginning and the end, the first and the last. It is one of the key problems that our country was preoccupied with at the very beginning. The way to stop it is through constitutionalism. If the people never want to give their power over to one of those flattering, manipulating, attractive, charismatic leaders, then the demagogue is diffused. That was the topic of the first book. In the years since, I started getting more concerned about a different problem, which was not the bottom-up issue of a healthy democracy that's saving itself from those classic problems. I'm more interested now in leadership. So you have, in any democracy, you have people who are taking part in any voting, taking part in civic affairs, but you do have leaders. right? Out of the people in this room, some of you are going to go on to be CEOs or hopefully members of Congress or running nonprofits or being the heads of your PTAs or being involved. How do we make leaders serve the best interests of democracy and not have democracy disintegrate into the worst fear of the Founding Fathers, which was a vulgar festival of the lowest common denominator and the passions where you can't trust anybody to do anything but play to people's prejudices. That is the worst picture of a vulgar democracy, and it is what we want to avoid. Madison had really clear ideas about how to avoid that, and they hinged on statesmen. So statesmanship. It's this really old-fashioned word, and usually when you think about a statesman, like the worst thing in the world comes to mind, which is somebody in alabaster on a pedestal who is completely unappealing and you feel that you can't relate to in the slightest. But that's wrong also, because statesmen were very much like us. They were human beings. They're people who hurl themselves into the to and fro and the flesh and blood of active fights that are going on in a country, and they build a state. And the key thing to me about statesmanship is the focus on the common good. So here's what Madison said. He said, the very goal of the Constitution was, I'm reading, this is a quote, was to enable leaders with the most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. So think about that phrase for a second, the common good of society. And I want to just think about it, all of the cynicism and the postmodern skepticism about there being an essence like that and the common good existing. I just want you to think about for a second that there is a common good in the country. We can have debates about what constitutes the common good, but there is a common good in any country, in any state, in any city. Aristotle distinguished, actually, he thought the common good was so important that it was a way of distinguishing between what he called pure and perverted regimes. And he said you have regimes where one person leads, many, or the few. In a few, when perverted interest led, when the special interest led, that was an oligopoly, when you had a small group of corrupt, self-interested people running the society. But he thought that you could even have a few people. It was called an aristocracy, the rule of the virtuous. We're not so into aristocracies anymore in modern societies, but in a democracy, he thought, Aristotle did, when special or private interests ruled and the many had power, that was a democracy, and that was a bad term. That was mob rule. But where the common good ruled, where you gave the power to the many, and where the common good was how they were reasoning about decisions, that was a constitutional republic. And that's what we want to have in this country today. So what does this mean for JMU students? Madison wrote a memo called Vices of the Political System in the United States, which he completed in April, right before going to the Constitutional Convention. And he argued that Americans should certainly extract from the mass of the society the purest and noblest characters which it contains. You all look pretty pure and noble to me. It might be in the middle of the week. We're not at the weekend yet. So how would this happen? The Constitution, unlike Plato's Republic, did not contain any mechanism where you would kind of pluck the best and the brightest from society. How does this happen? So there was a clue lies in a lecture that was delivered just before the American Revolution in 1775 by James Madison's teacher and mentor, John Witherspoon, who was also the president of Princeton. So Witherspoon was a Scottish-born cleric, and he was a member of the Constitutional Convention, and he delivered a sermon titled The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men, going back to our theme, where he called for a revolution against Great Britain that would be morally inspired and humble. And what he said is every good man should take a deep concern in promoting public virtue and bearing down on impiety and vice. And what he said, here's what might be controversial, but I want you all to think about it. The new democracy would require, he said, that certain classes of men are under peculiar obligations to the discharge of this duty. And he said that those certain classes of men, so lots controversial here. First of all, it's not obviously men. We should broaden this to include both genders. But he said, and it probably shouldn't use the term classes, because we don't like talking in terms of classes today, but it meant something different then. He said that those folks, those people, would include magistrates, ministers, parents, heads of families, commanding military officers, and he said those whom age has rendered venerable. So what he was saying is that there are people in any society who are taking leadership roles, and that can be a leadership role in your family. It can be the fact that you're an elder. It can be somebody who's taking responsibility for the course of society. So what I would argue is the way to bring this up to date now is to say that anyone and everyone who's a citizen of the United States of America and Virginia can have that self-appointed duty of taking very seriously that they are promoting public virtue and bearing down impiety and vice. To me, that's not even old-fashioned ideas of impiety and vice. That's just taking the common good seriously in our country and not being cynical about leadership. So what I think is so let's call that stewardship, stewards. Everybody in this room can be a steward over Virginia, over your home state if you're not from Virginia, over the course of the United States of America. Everyone here. It reminds me, there was a hilarious cartoon when I was little by the, it was by the forest fighters. And it had a cartoon of what was a cartoon character on the roof because he had seen an ad on TV which said only you can prevent forest fires. And so he sits on the roof all night kind of with a hose as if he's the only one who can prevent forest fires. But everyone here, only you can save the republic from a crisis of leadership. So it literally comes down to everybody in this room. So only you can make the democracy everything that it should be. So this goes to the positive obligations of democratic citizenship. And this is what I think is so exciting happening here under President Alger's leadership and with the civic engagement mission of this proud public university that happens or not happens to be named after James Madison. So these pillars of engagement that are here are incredibly exciting. Engaged learning, civic engagement, community engagement. The 8 key questions of fairness that you're all, I have my card in my wallet that I got in my package before coming here that I hope all of you carry this. It's really cool, I think, that you have this, this mission that you're being given and thinking about your role in society as virtue of being at a university. It's really a gift, even if it feels like it's like an obligation, it's a gift. So these questions, thinking about fairness, outcomes, responsibility, character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. And guys, I love this. I think this is cause for celebration. For what does our country need the most right now? It needs people in and connected to civic affairs, to government, to collective enterprises, who are engaged with the deepest questions and we're using them to shape outcomes. And we are definitely not going to solve any of these things through cynicism. So a word about cynicism. FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You all have heard this. So there is a corrosive, destructive power, FDR was saying, when the nation was heading into the Great World War, to fear. Fear would build on itself. It would undermine the war effort. It would undermine national spirit. We needed to work together to not be fearful. So I think similarly there's a corrosive power to cynicism. The ancient root of the word cynic is dog, actually, when I was looking it up. And to me, I love dogs. There's nothing wrong with dogs. But there is in that metaphor, though, not the most likable kind of dog, the snarling cur who's biting at your heels and who's rabid and who barks through the night and who is vicious. That's how I see cynicism. So it's always a question to ask yourselves, who benefits from cynicism in government or in collective enterprise? Because we have a lot of it right now. There has been, in the last several decades, a shift away in power from state and government. I'll talk about one movement in particular, the libertarian movement, which has seen a significant rise in the last several decades. It has brought about some incredibly thoughtful and important questions in American life, politics, government, economics. But what I might call substantive libertarianism has raised these valuable questions about the degree of personal freedom to be allowed and invited when government touches upon civil society. But what I might call vulgar libertarianism ignores such subtleties or such substantive questions and has brought a facile and intellectually dishonest approach to very complex issues of policy, particularly when so-called libertarians are enjoying tax credits and regulated schools, food safety and public schools and roads and the whole host of things that come with government. So when we start destroying or attacking government and viciously destroying it with cynicism about the very possibility of collective action, then we start to see what I'll talk about in a second, which is cynicism not just about politics or government, but about statesmanship. So when you make all politics, all political discussion anti-state, it becomes impossible to believe in statesmen or stateswomen because you've destroyed the boundaries between the personal and the political, between person and state. The personal lives of politicians become increasingly fair game because you're not interested in what they're doing on behalf of the state. You're not interested in statecraft. All that really matters is them as personal characters, as objects of fascination, as players in a drama that's about human beings. It's not about statecraft. I think that has ruinous consequences for the state in turn and for society. And we've seen that. A lot of the great statesmen, stateswomen in our country had highly checkered personal lives. But when we were interested in statecraft, we weren't making those personal lives the focal point of our public discussion. But when we become skeptical about the state, or when we've delegitimated it, or corroded it entirely because of cynicism that I'm talking about, then all of politics becomes a downward spiral. I don't think it's any accident that we're seeing at this moment a collapse of confidence in government itself. There are recent polls showing Congress is less popular than they ever have been, ever. In Robert Gates' recent memoir, this is the Secretary of Defense who stepped down, he kind of unloaded at Congress, describing the members en masse as, quote, uncivil, incompetent at fulfilling their basic constitutional responsibilities, such as timely appropriations, micromanagerial, parochial, hypocritical, egotistical, I'll take a breath, thin-skinned and prone to put self and re-election before country. In their recent book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, the bipartisan team of political scientists, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein, examined what they called the utter dysfunction of our politics and the disdain of our elected officials for finding solutions to our big problems. One example, they recounted then House Leader, and this is a bipartisan empirical analysis, Newt Gingrich's decision in 1994 to run against incumbent Democrats by pursuing the charge that Congress was all corrupt and needed to be blown up to change things. And there was a memo that was developed where he advised candidates to use certain words when talking about the enemy. Those words were betray, bizarre, decay, anti-flag, anti-family, pathetic, lie, cheat, radical, sick, and traitors. So these are cultural issues within our parties and within our political systems. Then there's broader trends and patterns, the cost of a political campaign for Congress or statewide political office, which has far outstripped inflation, the skyrocketing numbers of lobbyists or professionals in Washington, the budgets, the 24-hour news cycle, you could go on and on. But I think that despite or because of those things, we have audiences that are eager for substance, and we still have good people in public affairs. We had an interesting discussion today about whether all this causes us to be more skeptical rather than less about solutions. I think there actually is ground for hope. Two examples that I will give you, and these are bipartisan examples, and they're both what I would call Madisonian. Senator Rand Paul, who is a Republican senator from Kentucky, did he did a filibuster in Congress on drone policy last year. And that decision to take a whole day of Congress's time to provoke a really difficult discussion in our nation's policy about using drones to cross territories and attack alleged terrorist leaders of cells was very it was a great example of using the perch of a leadership post to really provoke a national discussion about an important issue of public policy. On the other side of the ledger, Tim Kaine, who is your senator, did another very bold confrontation with the White House about their use of the earlier authorization for the war in Iraq as the authorization for hostilities against ISIS, against the so-called Islamic State. And he succeeded in getting the president to reconsider their entire position to the extent that they're now pursuing authorization from Congress for hostilities against ISIS. I think that's probably directly attributable to what Tim Kaine has done. Those are both statesman-like actions where those guys were definitely talking about the common good, and they were engaged with the public in a way that was challenging us. And so for all the cynicism or skepticism that we could have about whether this exists in our politics, those are two vital recent examples where they have significantly altered the landscape on crucially important topics of public policy, and I think both of them deserve praise. And also your close attention, because these are models as we're looking forward for how to be citizens ourselves. So let me suggest to you a model. In our politics today, and this also comes from Madison, we are prone to look at political matters through either of two frames. One is as entertainment, and this comes because our media landscape is completely fragmented. You used to have 30 million Americans were watching a nightly newscast when the country had 150 million people. Now you have, the country is over 300 million, and you have 9 million people watching these nightly newscasts, and the rest are scattered across the winds to different extreme, talk radio or different cable channels. So we're not together really in our national discussion, and that has heightened the tendency for politics to be entertainment. The other thing is war, and we saw that in the Gingrich memo, that the object of a political process is to destroy your opponent, to destroy them personally, to destroy them professionally, to take them out of the game entirely. I would suggest to you that there is a vital and valuable other alternative third model, which is to view all of these matters as an athletic contest. And this was how it was in Madison's day. So we are all part of there's a wonderful book called The Last Great Senate, which was about the Senate in the 1970s, which was pretty functional. A lot of complex legislation on energy or ethics that came out of that Senate. What they all did, strong-willed people who had managed to get elected statewide and had big egos and could raise a lot of money and could certainly fight political fights, but they recognized that they had to play by the rules of the game, and they had to strike deals within the same body. That is how we ought to think about politics and about current events today, that it is a contest where we are trying to win, definitely. You're competing, but there are rules to the game, and after the game is over, after the contest is over, we are all neighbors and citizens together. I was laughing earlier on in the day, it's not that much more, everything goes back to elementary school. So this is like when you play soccer and you're 5 and after the game, you fight your heart out, and after the game, you go, good game, good game, good game, good game, and you're going down, and you're saying hello to the members on the other team, and then you have your orange slices, and everybody smiles. So we ought to be able to return to that spirit again in our public life. So here's how Madison fought hard. So one of the contributions of the book is to suggest leadership lessons from Madison. He had what I call Madison's method. So this appears throughout the book. I think it's an incredible drama when you try to understand how did this guy, and just to go back to the basics, he was 5 foot 4 inches tall, he was 100 pounds, he was so shy and so sensitive, and so, not only did he have panic attacks, he had hypochondria about panic attacks, which is kind of insult to injury. It was a very difficult time. He hated politics. He had a very difficult time public speaking. But he still managed again and again and again in the years leading up to the crucial victory, which is the culmination of this book at the ratifying convention in Virginia, to prevail over the mighty Patrick Henry, who was a titanic, charismatic, ruthless, very savvy revolutionary hero in a country that had just recently come out of a revolution. So Madison managed to defeat Henry in the ratifying Constitution in Richmond, Henry's home turf, in 3 weeks, which is this epic battle royale that really, I do hope, if anybody here is a screenwriter or is going to Hollywood, give me a call because I'd love to make this into a movie. So Madison's method, this was how he how he prevailed over these forces that seemed to be much mightier than him. So when he was, this wasn't even in college, when he was in high school still and being privately tutored, he was taking notes and he was reading about Socrates' method. Is anybody here going to law school? You know about the Socratic method. So the Socratic method is when the professor already knows the answer, puts you in his sights, and grills you and humiliates you and asks leading questions that he knows the answer to and makes you realize that you don't know the answer, and puzzling your way toward the answer is how the Socratic method works. That's what Socrates did in all these dialogues that Plato wrote. So Madison was reading about this when he's like 17 years old. And he criticized it very harshly in a way that I think was as sophisticated as any philosophy professor. And he said it was captious, and he called it condescending. And he was basically saying that there was a power trip or an authority relationship in the Socratic method that wasn't fair to reason itself. And what he wanted was an empowering way to engage in a dialogue or debate with somebody, but still win, okay? So that's what I call Madison's method, and it had 9 parts. So first, find passion in your conscience. So Madison himself almost never wavered from the gravitational pull of his conscience. So he would find a deeply held conviction, a conscience that was inspired by matters of general right and wrong. That could range from religious freedom to tax policy to military supplies to the structure of the country to trade relations. Some of these are not sexy issues to us, but deeply important ones that are affecting the whole common good. Okay? John Marshall, who became the Chief Justice of the United States, said at the end of his life, when he was asked who of all the orators he had ever heard was the most eloquent, he said, "Eloquence has been defined to be the art of persuasion. If it includes persuasion by convincing, Mr. Madison was the most eloquent man I ever heard." So second, and I was advised that Madison students would like this one the most, focus on the idea, not the person. So Madison knew that a powerful idea could structure a whole vision of a future. It could spark men's passions, people's passions, and it could swamp political alliances. And he knew, conversely, that if you destroyed an idea, the people behind them wouldn't matter quite as much. But this takes an entirely different frame of mind when we're so used to, like you're arguing with somebody and they get you so mad, and your instinct is to gun at the person. But there is an incredible power, especially if you're armed with this conscience, this conviction that we're talking about, to talking about their ideas instead. An incredible power, and we saw that over and over with Madison. So third, develop multiple and independent lines of attack. We are if anybody's taking debate here, or this is a $3 word, but we're too interested in parsimony. Parsimony means always stripping down and coming down to one simple, efficient argument and trying to blow apart an idea with one argument. That's not how Madison did it. He would come up with many different lines of attack, and he would throw the kitchen sink. These matters were so important, they demanded it. So he would employ logic. He would bring in ethical principles. He would look at history for examples. He would talk about political alliances. He would cite examples from other states. Whatever it took to make the best argument for his idea and against another idea, he would do it. So it was the opposite of, it was kind of like a festival or an embarrassment of riches. That was how he would engage and dive into a public debate on a matter of the common good. Fourth, embrace impatience. So we all know there are a ton of forces in politics and in public affairs that conspire to slow things down. The status quo is deeply interested in quiet and in staying put. And Madison would attack with impatience, and he understood the power of impatience. Fifth, establish a competitive advantage through preparation. So this means arming yourself. It's almost like an armory, or he would give himself the tools to be the most powerful person in the room by knowing what he talked about and by preparing. So you're not kind of going off the cuff. He would prepare. 6, conquer bad ideas by dividing them. If you've read Federalist number 10 or Federalist 51, you see how he would kind of focus on something, and he was very frustrating to his opponents, but he would divide something into 2 alternatives. And he'd say, you either men are either angels or they're not. You either have to, and he would drive you down the path of his own reasoning and plow ahead toward his conclusion. Seventh, conquer your opponent as you conquer yourself. He developed habits of mind and tenacity that I think came from his experience dealing with his own unruly self that you see in those anxiety attacks. Eighth, push the state to the highest version of itself. You can't be cynical about government or the state. He was pushing the state to achieve the most noblest version of itself. And finally, govern the passions, which I talked about. So Madison's method, if you were against him, was maddening at best and infuriating at worst, because he always knew more than you. He had anticipated most of your moves. He had planned out everything that he was going to say. He would drag his audiences through this series of choices they had no choice but to accept. It was a Socratic dialogue, kind of without the question marks. Precision, preparation, discipline, and control. And he seemed almost indefatigable. He was burning with an intensity during these things. And this helps explain why somebody so little, so unappealing, could become such a center of gravity and such a powerful force to so many people who were fascinated by how he was running these matters of great moment for the country. And most importantly, here's what I would ask you all to really think about. Because of this method, if you were his opponent and you revealed yourself to be in this arena for any selfish purpose or any special interest purpose that was transparently not a good faith effort to figure out what was the common good, that fact would become garish and obvious, and it would impeach your credibility per se because of the alternative that he had set up, because of how he was doing this bold and surprising and new way of that this little introverted, shy, whispering guy was engaging in vital gladiator combat on ideas. So back to those anxiety attacks. One of the things my book does is pick a fight, and this is a fun fight. There was a book that came out last year by Lynn Cheney, who is the wife of Dick Cheney, who has a PhD in history. She is a public intellectual in her own right, and she did a massive book just called James Madison. Very well-researched book. I enjoyed reading it. But she argues in the book that those anxiety attacks, those attacks that Madison had, were organic in their origin. I did a lot of research in this book, and I think it's one of the more interesting parts of the book in going through what was actually physically happening with Madison while these things were happening throughout his life. And there is a modern psychological term called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, which supports my thesis that these were psychosomatic experiences, that he did not have a bug or a tick or a disease, that he was collapsing because he felt too intensely the stakes of what it is he was involved in. And there's a lot more evidence for that. So when Madison left Philadelphia after his first term in Congress, his friend Thomas Jefferson thought he could easily become elected governor of Virginia if he wanted to. And then this very close friend of Jefferson told this very close friend of Madison's, named Eliza House Trist, that. And then she wrote back a letter saying that it would be too great of a sacrifice to make Madison governor. She was certain that, this is her words, that some wretch or another would write against Madison. And she said that Madison was too amiable in his disposition to bear up against a torrent of abuse. It will hurt his feelings and injure his health, she said. Take my word. This is very relatable to me. I've run, as we talked about, I've run for office. It is not easy for all the people who have problems public speaking or in situations that make you stressed, social or academic or professional situations. Imagine that times 100 for somebody who ends up, changing the country and changing the world and becoming president. So what happened at the ratifying convention was for 3 whole weeks, he was throwing himself into the ring again and again. And to me, the metaphor that comes to mind for understanding this guy, when we're plagued by that caricature that I was telling you about at the beginning, the heartless empire of reason, is you have a reluctant pugilist. You know, I would go, I mean, our pop culture has many models, but in the Karate Kid, right? So he is the last thing. It's hard to get in the ring, and it's hard if you're frail or you're not strong to throw yourself into a fight over and over again. But that's what Madison was doing. He didn't relish these fights, I don't think, but they were a means to an end of improving the whole country, and he desperately loved the country. He desperately loved it. So during that 3 weeks in this ratifying convention, this is the culmination of this book. There was Patrick Henry, who was this kind of larger-than-life figure, and bluster came as naturally to him as air, but he was very, very smart, whip-smart. And he was launching kind of the series of almost nihilistic attacks against the Constitution, which had come out of Philadelphia. And Madison was doing what I told you, this steady, grinding, tenacious application of his method over and over and over again. It was wearing him out. He had to leave. He had to come back. But what was so amazing was at the end of the ratifying convention in Richmond, there was this man named Zachariah Johnson, who we never hear from again in constitutional history. And he rises and he describes himself as a humble man from the poorer classes. He's not a famous person. He's not an intellect. But he rises sort of with, creaking and stands up and he says, and he had only spoken one other time, I think, and he said, but I have something to say, and he criticized the Anti-Federalists for the strained construction which has been put on every word and syllable, and for endeavoring to prove oppressions which can never possibly happen. And in the end, Madison won, and it was because he convinced a critical mass of the people, the undecided voters in that ratifying convention, to side with reason and against rhetoric and appeals to prejudices and flowery, exaggerated extremes and the passions. That's what happened. So where does this leave us today? So whether or not we have panic attacks because of it, we all have our own obstacles like Madison did. And I think cynicism is probably the greatest one of all that we all face. So we need to hurl ourselves over these obstacles just as Madison did for the sake of this experiment that we're all part. So here's another thing that Madison said. He wrote of the United States that the people who are the authors of this blessing must also be its guardians. In other words, the ultimate checks and balances in this constitutional, we have checks and balances, we have plenty of them, right? The checks and balances have changed over time as the country changes. Originally, you weren't allowed to vote unless you owned property. You weren't allowed to become a senator unless your state legislature elected you. Those were really deep checks on pure democracy, untrammeled democracy. Those have changed as our country grows and modernizes. But what the core of this successful country is, and this is what's going to what you all are doing here at JMU, is the ultimate checks and balances are the people themselves. And that's what Madison said. His words were, the people were the highest authority in this successful democracy. And this brings me to what the people themselves, all of us here, believe, and how very crucial our beliefs are. So belief is also an ancient word. In the medieval world, it was related to a faith in God. That was what belief meant. That was how it was applied. Even with our modern secular definition, which is kind of a commitment to principles, there's still something lingering in that idea. So when we believe something, when we believe it, that's not an idle affair. We are committing to whatever that thing is with the parts of ourselves that transcend this, that go to a realm greater than the instrumental, that go, you might even call it metaphysical, that requires faith in something above the kind of everyday affairs. So Madison was not a cynic. Despite what you've heard in these quotes that are kind of trumpeted about him, about men are not angels and whether or not he was a Calvinist or all these things, I have found in Madison, in his words and in his actions, a great optimism. So I think Madison believed in the prospect of man's self-improvement through government, through politics, and through the state. And his legacy to us, his political philosophy, has optimism built right into the heart of it. So there's a story from the ratifying convention of 1788. There was a debate about the congressional power to appoint federal judges. Madison saw a window to deliver a vision of an optimistic new republicanism, and he conceded that a lot of folks in the room, these delegates, were going to do, and that if Congress could appoint judges, that there would be every mischief that they possibly can. But what he argued was that we should still allow judges to be appointed by Congress because the people would have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom for Congress, who would in turn appoint non-corrupt federal judges. Okay, so the question was, would you have corrupt judges? And he challenged anyone who would oppose his Constitution on those very grounds. Is there no virtue among us, was what he asked the crowd. Without virtue, he said, we are in a wretched situation. He said no theoretical checks could save the country. Without virtue in the people, even liberty himself, he said, would be a chimerical idea, would be a ghost. So he reminded them that the Constitution required confidence, and he used that word. And he used that word 4 times in the next 4 sentences. He said that circulation of confidence was better than the circulation of money. Confidence, he said, produces the best effects in justice and would even raise the value of property. He felt that strongly about confidence and optimism in the experiment itself. So confidence in the federal government and in its statesmen at that time, I would argue, was the Constitution. Then his foe, Patrick Henry, his great nemesis, rose and attacked that very notion. So there was like a knockdown, drag-out battle about optimism. And he said there was no way that federal congressmen would mend every deed. He said, I can find no consolation in it. But Madison won that debate. And I would argue that optimism is at the core of the country. So just to wrap this discussion up, you all looking out on everyone here, from the professors to the students, there are huge questions facing this country right now, where these are life and death matters, and where you fall on these questions is at the core of it. The appropriate role of the private sector in healthcare, how schools should be designed, the role of the federal government in job creation, the size and scope of the military budget, how do we counter violent extremism around the world, gerrymandering in political districts, the federal role in research and innovation, campaign finance reform, sexual violence prevention, criminal justice policy vis-a-vis our history, carbon, immigration reform, 11 million people who are in this country who aren't citizens. These are big problems, and talking points and letting vested interests who have money or power solve them is not the right way to go, and it's not the Madisonian direction. What was it about the Founding Fathers that channeled their passions toward the country rather than themselves? Lincoln said in this address before the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield in 1838, when he was 28 years old and protesting a mob's lynching of an African-American man, he said that it was the Founding Fathers believed their destiny was inseparably linked with the state that they were building. They wanted to achieve this one great and noble aim, the capability of a people to govern themselves. We're told that our nation is in decline, but I regret that. In 1840, Thomas Carlyle, who was the great proponent of the great man, controversial great man theory of history, great women too, he said not only a hero is needed, but a world fit for him. So I think we can make the world fit for leadership again, but only if we believe in it again. And Shakespeare said, be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. Our path, and the one that comes from Madison's life and thought, is the middle option. We can achieve greatness just as we built a great nation on Madison's model. The choice truly is ours and yours. Thank you.